What's up, everybody, and welcome back. This is our fifth video on American industrialization, and in this one, we're really going to dig into what industrial labor was. Now, if there's anything that you came into this series with some idea of, it's this picture of what it meant to work in a factory in America in the 1800s. We've all seen those black and white pictures of, children sometimes as young as 8 or 9 with dirty faces surrounded by dangerous machinery, and we know that this labor was incredibly backbreaking and brutal. And the interesting thing about this is that this is sort of the fundamental paradox at the heart of industrial labor. Mechanization and industrialization meant that we had new advanced machinery that made workers more productive. With industrial machines, one worker could accomplish what it took 10 workers to do just a generation earlier. Yet despite this increased productivity, wages and quality of life fell for average workers in this time period. How could that be? If one person was being more productive, why were they getting paid worse? We're going to explore that question today using some economic principles. So let's illustrate these principles with two hypotheticals, and we're going to start not in a factory, but out in the fields of agriculture. Remember, we mentioned last time that agriculture was also something that was being industrialized and making farmers more productive if they could invest in these new techniques. So let's say that we're on a farm, and this farm is pretty big. Maybe it's owned by a successful farmer who hires 5 employees to help him work his land. Let's say that these 5 employees work 10 hours a day to plow a field. But this farmer, he's an innovator and he's got some money to spare, so he invests in a tractor. Let's say this tractor can be operated by 1 employee and can plow the same field in the same amount of time. So instead of 5 people working 10 hours to plow a field, you could have 1 person plow a field in 10 hours. This makes the individual employee 5 times more efficient. So what does the farmer do? Hypothetically, he could shorten their workdays. If each employee takes turns operating the tractor, they could do the same amount of work in the same amount of time and only each have to work 2 hours per day. They could spend the other 8 hours with their families or working on hobbies or doing anything. And everyone could make the same amount of money as before, assuming that amount of work yields the same amount of crops from those fields. But obviously, the owner's not going to do this. I mean, he just spent a bunch of money on that tractor. He wants to recoup that investment that he just made in the facilities and the materials. And obviously, he would say that the point of making the investment was making more profit than before. I mean, otherwise, why would he take the risk on the investment? So just doing some quick math here, if the tractor makes 1 employee as efficient as 5 employees, then the farmer should lay off 4 of his employees, and then whoever stays on, he now has a job driving a tractor for 10 hours a day instead of plowing a field by hand for 10 hours a day. The farmer can now keep their 4 wages as additional profit for himself. I mean, that sounds like a pretty good deal, right? But actually, if the farmer really wants to maximize his profit, he'll fire all 5 employees and then tell them that he's going to hire back whoever agrees to work for the lowest wage. I mean, these 5 guys just got laid off. They have no income. If they're desperate enough, one of them will be happy to come back, continue working the same hours at a pay cut. And this is due to a concept that we've studied already. We've discussed competition as a mechanism between providers of a good or service where people are going to want to keep their prices as low as possible so that they can get more business. The flip side of this is that when there is a surplus of labor, when there are lots of people looking for work, workers will actually compete with one another and accept lower wages, keeping their pay down. I mean, if someone is desperate and hungry enough, they might literally agree to work for peanuts. And this is great news for the owners of businesses and companies because as long as there are lots of people looking for work, they can offer really, really low wages and keep the difference as their own profit. I mean, if you think about it, under a capitalist system, labor is just another type of commodity. When people agree to work for an hourly wage, they're selling an hour of their work in exchange for an amount of money. And just like any other good or services, if there is a great surplus, if there's an excess of a particular product, its value goes down. In this sense, high unemployment, lots of people looking for work is great news for the people owning these factories and farms and all of the business owners throughout the industrial era, because it keeps workers competing against one another, and that competition keeps wages low. Unfortunately for workers, industrialism didn't just lower wages of average workers, it also fundamentally changed the nature of work in the industrial era. And to illustrate this point, let's zoom in on another industry. Let's talk about shoes. In the pre-industrial era, if you wanted a pair of shoes, you had to go to someone who made shoes, someone called a cobbler. And this person would have spent years as an apprentice learning the process from a master. Let's say that you go in there as a customer. This master cobbler might take your measurements, it would design your product, and complete it from beginning to end using a variety of tasks and skills. Now, this is a lot of work and a lot of really delicate work, but as a result, there's an opportunity for that cobbler to show some maybe artistry or take some pride in his work in producing shoes that reflect the master's style or skills or even maybe a little bit of their personality. Also, more likely than not, that final product is going to be very high quality, but also pretty expensive because you're paying for the time and experience of a guy who does this professionally. Now, let's fast forward 100 years. Most people aren't buying shoes from cobblers because they're too expensive. Instead, they're buying mass-produced shoes from industrial factories. These shoes are created in mass with no given consumer in mind, so instead of getting a high-quality product that's made for you, you have to buy something that's approximately your size from one of a handful of styles designed to appeal to the most people possible. Your final product is going to be much lower quality, but also much lower cost, and so people are encouraged to just discard things when they don't need them anymore or if they're worn out and buy new ones. In the short term, this might be cheaper and more efficient, but after a couple hundred years of this consumer disposal-based economy, I think we're seeing that this also has some big picture downsides to our economy and our environment. But let's put the shoe itself aside and look at the people making the shoes. The people working in that shoe factory are not master cobblers who were trained over many, many years in a variety of skills. Instead, you have industrial workers who might be hired and put to work in the exact same day. And that's because the tasks that they're doing in their workday is not some highly skilled, highly specialized thing like precision stitching or design. It's probably some repetitive task that's done all day long, maybe cutting the same fabric in a pattern or punching holes for shoelaces, probably for 12 hours a day. So while this industrialization might allow you to produce more shoes more quickly and cheaper, we need to recognize how work has changed in the process. We've watched skilled labor, like the cobbler who has a variety of skills that he builds over years and years, has been replaced with unskilled labor, which is basically operating a machine or doing a repetitive task, something that someone could be trained on in an afternoon. The long-term effects of this transition from skilled to unskilled labor results in a dramatic drop in wages. I mean, think about it. If there's one cobbler in your town, you're going to have to pay him enough to live a decent life, because otherwise he's going to leave and no one's going to have any shoes. Meanwhile, the factory doesn't have to pay the shoelace hole puncher enough to live a decent life because anybody could come in off the street and do his job. As long as businesses are trying to maximize their profit, which is the whole point of capitalism, part of that includes lowering expenses, including wages. So the less the boss pays the shoelace hole puncher, the more profit he gets to keep. And as long as there are people outside the factory looking for work that could replace the shoelace hole puncher, guess what? The boss is only going to pay that hole puncher enough to keep him coming in the door and punching the holes. And to just pause on the economics here for a second, I want you to think of the psychological effects of this type of labor. In contrast to earlier forms of labor, which involved a variety of tasks, workers were now working one repetitive mechanical task for 12 plus hours a day. This offered no opportunity for pride in work or enjoyment of labor, no sense of accomplishment, and competition for work meant that workers were always looking over their shoulder, expecting someone else to try to take their job, all while keeping their wages lower than they'd ever been before. And since there was no federal minimum wage, there's no minimum wage law in the United States until the 1930s, this surplus of labor and this competition between workers drives wages incredibly low in the industrial era. Sometimes, particularly in isolated work areas like mines or timber camps, wages would actually be zero, and some workers would accept company scrip, which is a special currency that you can only use in your company's store. Workers would be forced to buy everything that they need from the company store using a special currency at inflated prices. So in these situations, you literally have workers who are stuck in a particular industry, working a particular job, in exchange for a place to sleep and something to eat. Congratulations, industrial capitalism, you've reinvented feudalism. A far more common phenomenon in industrial workplaces, particularly in cities, is the creation of what was called sweatshops, where workers would work long hours for low wages in an incredibly cramped, tiny industrial space. At the time, there were no workplace safety regulations, so bosses would further cut costs by allowing unsafe and unsanitary conditions in these workplaces. The horrific danger of sweatshop labor was illustrated March 25, 1911, in Manhattan when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory set on fire. In this factory, the bosses allowed heaps of flammable fabric and lint to accumulate throughout the workshop, and even locked the exit doors to prevent girls from taking unauthorized breaks. When a fire broke out, the workers were completely unable to escape, and in total, 146 garment workers, mostly women and girls, some as young as 14, perished in the blaze. It's worth noting that most of these workers were immigrants, mostly Italian and Jewish, who were working for some of the lowest wages in the city. For our primary source today, let's look at another famous wake-up call to the horrors of industrial capitalism. We're going to read an excerpt from a book called The Jungle, which was written by Upton Sinclair. Sinclair was what we call a muckraker journalist, meaning he was someone who kind of looked around in the ugly parts of society, looking to draw attention to problems. He was also a socialist, which we'll talk about more next week, but for now we'll just say means he's a critic of capitalism. He wrote this novel, The Jungle, after working undercover in the Chicago stockyards. Now, this novel was written in 1906, which is before the advent of widespread refrigeration. Now, think about what that means for a city like Chicago, which at the time was growing very, very rapidly. In big cities, people are living in very close quarters in places like tenement houses. And if you're living in a one-room apartment with 5 other families, you can't exactly fit a cow in there for you to slaughter and eat when you're hungry. People didn't have refrigerators, they couldn't get refrigerated meat, they had to buy it fresh. So in big cities like Chicago, they had massive stockyards where millions of cattle and livestock would be brought in to be slaughtered fresh and delivered to the population of the city. I suspect you might see where this is going. Imagine working an industrial job with no workplace safety standards in a place where thousands of animals are butchered every day. And in a society with so many impoverished workers, a big part of the market is producing the cheapest possible meat. In this passage, Sinclair is going to describe the types of things that he saw while working in these stockyards, and I'm going to give you a warning right now that if you've got a weak stomach, you might not want to listen to this part. Cut up by the grinders and mixed in with a half-ton of other meat, no rotten ham could ever make any difference. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor, in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had stepped and spit. There would be meat stored in great piles, and the water from the leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. The packers would put out poisoned bread for the rats, and they would die, and then the rats, the bread, and the meat would all go in the sausage together. Now, I want you to imagine that you're eating your breakfast sausage, and you picked up this new book by Upton Sinclair, and you read this about what might be inside your meat. People were obviously horrified by what they read, and in a society with so many problems, this was just one of the more famous exposés that came out in this time period. An exposé is a journalistic report meant to expose a problem in society. Shortly after Sinclair published The Jungle, Congress passed the first Food and Drug Act, which guaranteed standards of safety in the production of foods and medicines. This law was seen as a triumph of progressivism, which again is the belief that the government should intervene in the economy to solve social problems. I mean, free market efficiency is great, but I think most people would trade a little bit of efficiency for the security of knowing there's no rat turds in their sausages. Progressivists believed that the government could be used to regulate industry to make lives better for the common people. But many industrial workers thought that the government would always side with big business over their interests. These workers often sought to take matters into their own hands and improve their lives themselves by working together and forming unions. We'll talk about that next time. So to recap, in this episode, we talked about how industrial efficiency led to a shift from skilled to unskilled labor in the industrial economy. We talked about labor as a commodity in itself and how surplus labor and competition between workers led to lower wages during the Industrial Revolution. We also talked about the dangers of sweatshops and talked about how muckrakers were journalists who wrote exposés to draw attention to social problems. Next time, we'll talk about unions and how workers tried to take some power back themselves. I'll see you then.